Ross Range, it's good to have you back.
Thank you, Jack.
What a marvelous book. The Year That Made Hitler, 1924. And I found myself looking at the date, the topic, and I said to myself, why would Peter do this now? And there's one thing, of course, that I knew about, which was the 70th anniversary of the republication of Mein Kampf was going to be legalized and available. How much of that was an impact and how much of it wasn't?
I would say more than half of it was that I was looking for something to write in German history. I was looking at the Third Reich and Hitler, and I discovered a gap in the literature around this year of 1924, his year in prison, the year he had the sensational treason trial, the year of writing Mein Kampf. And there had never been a book written just about this year. And to my great surprise, there had never been a book in German or in English about the trial itself. That, combined with the realization that the coming republication of Mein Kampf at the crack of 2016 would be sensational, would be pretty big news, convinced me it was a good idea.
And when you went over to start work on this, and you found that there was nobody that had written on this, even in German, you're telling me, there was
right.
little work that had been done. What was the German reaction?
Well, I think I took people a little bit by surprise. Of course, most of the archivists and the librarians there have been dealing with researchers on this topic forever. So, you know, you're just another person walking in. You could be a PhD candidate. They don't know. They're responding to your efforts. But I got very lucky and unearthed some stuff that most people didn't know about, particularly regarding Hitler's trial.
Mm-hmm. And was the access easy? I mean, did you say that you wanted to find stuff, but you had to look under every nook and cranny before you find it, or
the answer is yein. Yes and no. You know, people were helpful and cooperative, but the system itself is not easy to use, and each archive has different rules and protocols. As you may know, copying materials in German archives is still not as simple as it is in our archives, or at least not in the ones I used in Munich. You can't just walk in with your own camera and take pictures of documents like you can in a lot of places now. You know, it had its ups and downs, but it was a thrill, especially somebody like me who comes out of journalism, you know, who is used to the thrills of the daily excitement and deadlines. I was surprised how much of a thrill I would get out of finding something in an archive that was hard to find and then succeeding in doing it. It was an adventure.
Now, you spend most of your time in the book, looking at the period of time in the prison and what he did with that 13 months,
yes,
roughly speaking.
Correct.
And then you also, at the very end, talk a little bit about, you know, where he went from there, and then, of course, we know what happens after that. When you think about it now in retrospect, and you think about the fact that that moment, that pivotal moment of 1923-24 was so important to his rise, did it strike you when you looked around Europe, because you're also familiar with other countries there, that something similar was going on around other parts of Europe at that time? Mussolini apparently was an influence.
Yes, he was. You know,
Hitler at this time.
Yeah, very much so. Mussolini really gave Hitler the idea for the putsch in Munich and the March on Berlin, along with Kemal Pasha, later known as Ataturk, who had staged his coup from outside the capital in Ankara. So Hitler staged his coup outside Berlin in Munich. That was part of the plan. But the famous Mussolini 1922 March on Rome had a big impact on Hitler. Particularly, he said in a speech right about that time, this shows what a small band of really dedicated people can do. So it increased Hitler's rampaging megalomania even more, and gave him the idea that if you had an intense enough will and dedication, even just a small group of guys could take over the whole German government.
Although it's interesting, one of the points you make in there is that after the failed putsch in November 23, he came out of this experience that you described, and it seemed like he was saying, well, we're going to have to go through the system to overthrow the system. That was different than the putsch.
That's what makes the year in prison such a major turning point. Mm-hmm. He realized in the course of his imprisonment that he had used up all of his chances as a revolutionary. For the first 4 years of his political life, he considered himself a revolutionary. He said, I thought about nothing but revolution every day. He forbade any of his members to run for office or to take part in the parliamentary system at any level. But after the failure of the putsch, he realized the other guys have the guns, and if you can't convince them to join you, which is exactly what happened in his failed putsch. He failed to enlist the military in the putsch, then you don't have a chance. And so he told one of his followers, it may take us longer to outvote them than to outshoot them, but at least the results will be guaranteed by their constitution. In other words, he would use the Weimar rules to take over the Weimar Republic, or the Republic as it was called at that time. And then, of course, he would get rid of the parliament, he said. We'll work our way into the parliament only to get rid of it.
And 10 years later, he was there
Exactly.
and went back to the prison, which had become a shrine in the meantime.
Exactly.
In Germany. Peter, let me go back to that point about the fact that you were aware that Mein Kampf was going to come out again, and it was going to spark an enormous debate, I guess on both sides. But for the most part, the way I followed it, at least it seemed like most people were saying, it's time, this can be handled. You brought with you the new version of Mein Kampf, which is 2,000 pages of work.
12 pounds.
12 pounds, look at that, amazing. Heavily annotated, obviously, and so forth. Talk a little bit about that in light of what you're looking here at something 70, 80 years ago, and yet you're in Germany when this is about to happen.
Oh, yeah.
How
well,
is that?
It added excitement and urgency and topicality to what I was doing, obviously. I had written 2 years ago about the debate that was going on in Germany in 2014 when the Bavarian government suddenly withdrew its funding, its support for the project because of a trip that Mr. Seehofer had taken to Israel with Charlotte Knobloch, the head of the Jewish community in Munich,
in Munich, yeah.
In Munich, and he had reversed his decision, along with the cultural minister, Mr. Spengler, on supporting the project. As it turns out, they never did really withdraw their money. The whole thing ended up being a kind of a fig leaf operation, and they said they would forbid that their name or their insignia, their Wappen, would be included in the front of the book. The editors told me there was never any plan to put anybody's insignia or coat of arms in the front of the book in the first place, so that was kind of a moot point. But it was a very, very tense moment. There was talk of prosecuting anyone who published Mein Kampf under the incitement laws in Germany. And of course, there still is. There's another, not exactly fig leaf, but another interesting shadow hanging over the whole thing, which is at the Conference of the Conference of Justice Ministers about some months ago, came out and said that if anybody tries to publish an unannotated version of Mein Kampf, they will be prosecuted. Now, whether they can be successfully prosecuted or not, we don't know. But this was a way of warning off anybody who wants to just capitalize on the public domain status of Mein Kampf now to put out a quickie paperback and make some money to run those people off, or sort of a neo-Nazi effort, let's say, right-wing effort to turn it into a real propaganda piece. I don't think they need to worry about that, frankly. But it is also true that no self-respecting neo-Nazi is going to read this book, Jack. It is it's a hard slog. I mean, it's organized like a Talmud. I'm quoting Dan Mickman, the head of international research at Yad Vashem in Israel, who pointed this out to me. The Mein Kampf text is the least of the book. The book is 2,000 pages, only 782 of which are Hitler's. More than 1,200 pages are the researchers. If I can just hold this up for a second so your viewers can see.
Amazing.
Yeah, and the slightly bold-faced section right here is the Mein Kampf. Just as in a Talmud, it would be the scripture.
Okay.
And then all the rest is commentary around here. And then in this column over here, you have textual variations.
Wow.
You know, this is the first edition of Mein Kampf. There were 1,100 printings in 20 years. So a lot of words and got changed, some grammatical improvements over the years. and they felt compelled to make notation of all of them.
Stunning.
It's stunning.
Yeah. Of course, you have a copy of the original there, don't you?
Yeah, this is what a sort of an everyday version looked like in the 20s and 30s. Not this book jacket was not on the first edition, but came later. This is 782 pages. My particular copy is the 1943 Volksausgabe, the People's Edition, 2 volumes in einem Band, in one book. And this is what I used for writing my book. This was not yet out, unfortunately.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm sure they found what you wrote is exactly what they meant in there. let me switch something to more contemporary issues, because one of the things that I was thinking about is you see that happening in 1924. Hitler refers to things about the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back. There are things that he calls on to incite the kinds of anger and resentment, and therefore the turmoil that came out of that, and eventually, of course, was successful in doing so. You must have been thinking about the current turbulence around Europe and perhaps elsewhere, about how this legacy of that kind of extremism, which took over not only a country but virtually, held a whole continent hostage. You must have been thinking about, what do we learn from this for today?
Right. Well, I'm not one of those who sees strong connections, and I'm not an alarmist on this topic. I will say a word or two about Mr. Trump if you want to, and some comparisons. But I was there during some of the Pegida marches and AfD activity in Dresden, and I don't really and truly see echoes of the 20s in that. The situation then, with the exception of the refugee pressures, which have now come along since I finished my research, it's gotten much, much more dramatic, obviously. I finished my research in Germany a year ago, but the situation in Germany, we forget, and that's one of the things I learned, was much worse than we can really hardly imagine. The post-war situation was horrible. The political situation was constantly in turmoil. The inflation, of course, out of hand. Hunger riots, German policemen shooting hungry Germans in the streets, because the farmers wouldn't release the crops because the inflation would kill the profit on the food. Occupation of the Ruhr area by the French and the Belgians.
1923.
This is all 1923.
Yeah.
Not to mention other crazy stuff, the murders done by the Organisation Konsul, Altsberger, as well as, of course, Rathenau, and I think 343 right-wing assassinations had occurred in about a 3.5-year period, most of which we don't even know about. So it was Hitler was building on a much worse situation than anybody is today.
Okay, but I mean, nevertheless, there are concerns. People are looking at what's happening in various different parts of Europe and even as far west as east as Russia. I mean, what do you take from this as signals that when you read books these days, there are lots of things that say we have to know better what happened then so it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. But where do you come out in terms of
the
lessons?
Authoritarianism is the real, the constant theme. Hitler really figured that out, that he could play on the great man theory. It wasn't called that then, so far as I know. He may have been one of the originators of the great man theory. He called it Persönlichkeit, which then fit into his idea of a Führerpartei, a Führerprinzip, the leadership principle. And we see that, I think, particularly with Mr. Putin in the East, and also sort of echoes of that in some of the French right-wing activity, and certainly in our own election. So, yeah. But I don't have any magic bullets for how you thwart it on the basis of what we know from then.
Yeah. But, I mean, I think that one of the things that you talk about here in the book is, the legacy that was really basically picked up in a period of time in Germany well after 1945. I mean, my experience in Germany was that dealing with the past, dealing with what made this man possible, dealing with the legacy of the Nazi period, took a very long time in Germany to get started. As a matter of fact, I remember when I was in Tübingen in 1978, there was that American feature film called Holocaust, which set a lot of things in motion in terms of talking about this. Germany has done, I think without any particular caveat here, an enormously good job of dealing with what's what's happened and what the lessons are, and as we say here at AICGS, learning how to remember but also to renew. And one wonders sometimes, whether that lesson has to be learned over and over again. I think this book is a contribution to that.
Thank you. And the answer, of course, is yes. It always has to be learned over and over again. And that's, once again, to their credit, the fact that this doesn't stop. There was another new book on Mein Kampf before this book came out a few months ago by Sven Felix Kellerhoff of Die Welt, which is a wonderful book. It's a good history of the book and goes into a lot of these kinds of details. It's yet another way of another piece of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, if you will, of grappling with the past. You remember from your student days, Jack, I remember from my early journalistic days, I was in Berlin in 1967, experienced the beginning of the student movement, was there on the night that Benno ohne Sorge was shot in front of the Berlin Opera, the German Opera in Berlin. And as you know, that began opening the door on the past in its own way.
Right.
The sons questioning the fathers and forcing a more open discussion. So I, like you, have a view of Germany as having done an outstanding job in this area. The fact that I could find what I wanted to find in the archives and that they've done such a fabulous job of preserving what they could preserve speaks to that. I'll pass on a brand new little point, which I got an email this morning from the new NS-Dokumentationszentrum, the new National Socialism Documentation Center in Munich, which is about Munich, not about Germany. And Munich finally, belatedly, is grappling with its past, according to everything I read and that they say. They were late.
You mean the city? Or?
The city.
Yeah.
The city had not been quite willing to admit its central role in the rise of Hitler, according to what I read while I was there a year ago. And they've produced this fabulous piece of architecture on the spot where the Brown House, where Hitler's party headquarters stood in the Brennerstrasse. They emailed today that they have in 10 months have 200,000 visitors. This is a small building and a relatively small exhibition compared to a major museum. And they have all kinds of teaching programs and school classes, but 200,000 visitors in 10 months. That is proof of the curiosity and the determination to learn and to deal with this stuff, it seems to me.
Yeah, it certainly is. And one would hope that it would spread around in different parts of the world. So what if I said to you now, boy, you really found a gap. You said that right at the start. You walked into something and it was ready to be dealt with. Are there others? Did you find that there were other gaps out there that still need work?
If I had, I probably wouldn't say it publicly right now. I am a writer who, does this for a living. And writers are always chary about talking about future projects. I will say, however, that I think it's an appropriate thing to do the next tranche of the Hitler story, which is, my book ends on the day that he refounds the Nazi Party
Right.
in February 27th, 1925, back in the same Bürgerbräu Keller,
Right.
the beer hall. And then the question is, what happens in those next 8 years? Now, that has been written many, many times in many, many books, but there's never been a book just on those 8 years, told in sort of the same style as this book. As you pointed out, I was able to introduce a lot of dialogue. If you work hard enough in the archives, you find this stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
And basically, that's what I did.
Well, you pick out a topic. I remember the very first time I talked about the November of 23 was around the time of November of 1989. And I was remembering how many of those Novembers
Yes.
had made a difference in
Yes.
German history.
Yes.
November of
1918.
1918, 1923,
Yes.
1938, and then 1989.
Yes.
It's a fascinating overlap, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Hard to explain.
It is, but it's something that really does generate this kind of curiosity and this kind of terrific work, and we appreciate you coming over and talking to us about it. Thank you much.
Thank you, Jack.
See you soon.